As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining us is a voice you're familiar, someone I consider a mentor, a friend. I'm not going to say elder. Professor Zubairu Wai, welcome back to The Malcolm Effect, Professor. How are you?
I am good. Thank you guys for having me. It's always a pleasure. No, Mamadou, it's okay. You could say an elder. That's okay. He always calls me uncle, and now he wants to say, I'm not going to say an elder.
No, exactly.
And if you continue, we'll actually revoke your African card, because in Africa, when you get older, that's when you get respected.
Exactly. You see,
young people are considered to be haughty and right. So anyway, that's fine.
No, exactly. And a voice you're familiar with, my co-host Christian Joseph, and making his Malcolm Effect debut, my brother, Mr. Ethan Levine. How's it going?
What's up, bro? Thank you for having me.
It's an honor and privilege. So I want this conversation to be free-flowing, but I really want to speak about Pan-Africanism today. And I think it's important because there are several recurring conversations that come up when we speak about the project of Pan-Africanism. Namely, this question of indigeneity and indigenous knowledge. Thinking about, we often hear that we need African solutions for African problems. So I want to throw the first question at you, Professor. When you hear this question of we need African solutions for African problems, this is normally contrasted with what is said as to be Western forms of knowledge. And there's that Western forms of knowledge cannot deliver Africa or cannot take Africans towards liberation. So I guess my first question is, how do you understand indigeneity and indigenous knowledge in the context of Africa?
Okay. Thank you very much. Wow, that's such quite an opening. African solutions to African problems. Theoretically, I will not be against that. But the question is, what is African? When we say, right? So the qualifier, the adjective African is the problem. So African solution, what exactly is it? And in my understanding, the way in which African has been used in most, if you go back the period of decolonization, right? This idea of what Africanity, even in terms of government or the education system, the universities, they were we have to Africanize. What they actually had in mind and the way it was used originally is basically the practices and belief systems that are said to be endogenous to a particular local place, in this case, African cultures, right? And so there is a notion of primordiality that is tied to it. Claims of the existence of, for instance, an epistemic or cultural essence embedded in local cultures and ways of life, ways of apprehending the world. And this, they said, is constitutive of a difference that makes them radically different from Western systems of knowledge, Western systems of government and practices, right? So when it is deployed that way, in terms of indigeneity, in terms of African solutions, this is how usually it is deployed. The problem then is that when you frame it that way and you start thinking of African solutions from primordiality, that there is a local essence in African cultures, automatically you run into problem. Because then the first thing is that you ask the question, what exactly is African? And most of the liberation struggles generation were such individuals located in multiple places. They were all Western educated. Many of them were Marxists, but at the same time, they were calling on local cultures. And so that is the problem. And let's take a step back. So let's go to Valentin Mutimbe's The Invention of Africa. I find that book very interesting and very important in the sense that he takes a look at this idea of decolonizing or Africanizing knowledge or Africanizing practices and all. And what he found, it's so interesting. It's like most of the most radical ideas even with negritudious ideas. It's either you are reproducing or you are inventing a particular notion of Africa, or you are using Western epistemic systems in order to be able to retrieve that which you say is African. So the issue here is not that you do not have indigenous systems that exist. The issue here is now that you do not have African cultures, African ways of viewing. But the idea here is that for you to be able to take that and make it useful within the context of the nation state, within the context of the university, you will have to remove them from their local, if, for lack of a better word, essences or indigenous primordial nature and bring them into the Western systems in which you are trying to make them useful. And in that case, then, the very system that you are trying to retrieve loses some version of its localness. So the issue here then is that for Mudimbe and for me, when we think of African solutions for African problems, I think the starting point has to be understanding that the African is never static. The African is not just the man in the bush, but even the man in the bush or the woman in the bush, in inverted commas, has been touched by colonial power systems, have been touched by modern systems. So I'll give you an example. In Sierra Leone, one of the dominant ethnic groups is the Mende. There is a common saying: if there is a challenge, let's say, for instance, you have to lift a big boulder or you have to do like a big work that requires sheer out of the wall physicality and mentality, there is an expression that they will use. It's "Saleh como Saleh." And you are like, wait, what are they trying to say? Then it dawned on me that it's actually an English expression that has been appropriated within the local language. It is challenge, come on, challenge. But you will never know that that's what it is. So chale como chale or sale como sale, it's actually challenge, come on, challenge. Let's put all of our efforts to challenge this. I guess the point that I'm trying to make then is this. If we think of African solutions, then we have to think of African situatedness, not necessarily a primordial African situatedness. It could be that you could go into local cultures and take some of that stuff, but bearing in mind that whatever it is that you are taking has to be converted to be put in the use in the present. So it has to speak to the present conditions that we are, whatever problem we are trying to address. That is one. But secondly, it involves a little bit of invention in order and adaptation to fit the current condition within which we are using that. So African solutions has to be African situatedness in the sense that the African himself or herself is not just this one static individual that is just located, but actually inscribes multiple locations and positionalities. But you bring all of that and you say, for instance, we ask the question, what does the world look like if we look at it from an African perspective?
Absolutely.
African perspective, what does it look like if we say from our grounded normativity, we say Africa is our location. That's the center from which we speak. However, that is defined with its multiple contaminations and contradictions. That is the way you approach the world, and that's the way you approach the problem. So let me end on this. So finally, then it will be in terms of conflicts, for instance, it does not mean you have to ignore local conflict management mechanisms. But you cannot say that that is the only way in which you resolve conflict. You also have to, what are some of the influences that come from abroad that could be adapted to local conditions that allow you to be able to deal with those problems? So I think that, if you ask me, African solutions for African problems, it has a merit, but with the caveat that I have given, that we have to be careful not to collapse Africa with some form of primordial nativist understanding of cultures that remain static, because normally that's really what is embedded in those solutions, right? Or in those claims.
Absolutely. And I think so. I thank you so much for that answer. 'Cause I think what you're touching at is there is a presentation of Africa which abstracts the continent of Africa from history.
Thank you.
As if to say there is an essentialized African essence untouched by modernity,
Thank you.
unmuddied by the modernity that can somehow, if we just go to that is which is untouched and perfected, it can offer a solution within our time. And again, I ask the question: when has Africa ever not been within a globe within the globe, right? When has Africa ever been abstracted to the point where there's a brilliant piece of a quote by Du Bois in which he says that, from the 12th century, the Western man knew Africa. There might have been some mythic understanding, but chiefly knew them as a man still. There was still that interaction taking place. But Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to follow up because I think you even mentioned negritude. And when you were speaking and we're talking about a collapsing of the particularities of African culture and creating a more in-depth historical perspective, I think of like on the chapter on national culture by Fanon and Wretched of the
Yep.
Earth. And he takes a jab at negritude. And I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a particular, this kind of collapsing of Africanness, this simplifying of Africanness, and this essentializing of Africanness, do you think it has more of origins out of a particular, it's almost born out of the West? Because the thing about negritude is that that's something that's born out of African and Caribbean scholars when they're in the
In
West,
France.
right? When they're in France. And even further, right, like in that chapter on national culture, Fanon talks about, the colonized intellectual and the colonized intellectual going through these different stages. And then there becomes this stage of romanticization. There becomes this stage in which you're situated in the metropole and you have these just wrong-headed ideas of where you come from. So do you think kind of this simplifying of Africanness, this lack of historical nature of an
Historical.
analysis of Africa comes from that, really a Western vantage point?
I have to start by saying that I do understand what Senghor and Césaire and others were trying to do, right? The fact that we are having this conversation means that those who came before us had to struggle with systems. And Sheikh Anta Diop, for instance, was failed several times because they were like, oh, no, we don't. And then, right, it's only when he published what was supposed to be his thesis, everybody was like, okay, well, we need to pay attention to this guy, brilliant guy and stuff. So those are the struggles that they had to go through. And you also have to understand that negritude developed out of French colonial system of assimilation. This is why negritude only could develop within the French context or the Portuguese context and not necessarily the Anglophone context, even though there is some form of assimilation that is taking place. Because the idea is that African cultures, as represented by French colonialism, is backward. And for you to really be civilized, you have to be Frenchified. And to be Frenchified then means that basically there are all of these. You have to be born in the four communes of Senegal, become a Christian, have one wife, get educated, like all of that, right? But the French colonial system basically was to cause Black people to become Black French men and French women. And part of that representation is to say Africa has no culture, you guys are backward and stuff. And in Anglophone Africa, we're dealing with that. Like the founding document of Sierra Leone, for instance, says it was basically a glorious project in which they were trying to create Black Englishmen. But the way in which French assimilation functioned, it was not the same way in which English assimilation function, because the English or the British still believe that, you have your culture, and then they weaponize the culture to become the locus of colonial power. The local state became the basis of imposing some of the most stringent and violent assimilative violence in people's lives. So we know this. So the French from the start, for you to be considered a human being, you had to be civilized. La mission civilisatrice. And for you to be civilized means that you had to become French. Senegal recently just built a new airport in 2017. The airport is named after Blaise Diagne, right? And I was like, what? But that's the point. And Blaise Diagne was one of the first assimilationist Black people to serve in the French National Assembly and all of this. So we know that history. So when we're thinking of negritude, we can't just dismiss it. We have to understand the context within which it emerged. Having said that, you also have to understand Senghor and Césaire are two of the most brilliant French speakers that ever existed. So these are the people who are talking about negritude. But when Sankara took over Burkina Faso and changed the name from Upper Volta and renamed it Burkina Faso using the local Mori and Fulbe and all of those languages, and then he says, we are not going to have Burkina Noir, we are going to have Burkinabe, which is come from full bay. In order to be bay is a suffix that indicates a person. So Burkina Bay then becomes the citizen. Senghor did not like it. He didn't like it because he said it did not conform to the standard French designation of nationality and stuff. Bukinoir would have been the right way of naming the city. And Sankara was like, I don't care about what you have to say and stuff, right? Why am I bringing these contradictions? It goes back to the conversation we were having. Now, most of the people who are claiming culture are so colonized that they are incapable of actually extricating themselves from their colonial standpoint. And in actual fact, it is that colonial lens that is allowing them to be able to go back and appropriate local culture and say, this is what it is. So that's the first thing that I have to say to this. But the second thing also is that, and recently I was at Codesrea in Dakar, a conference on indigenous knowledge, a new project that they are launching, and I was giving the keynote. And I had to caution against this, especially in this moment of decolonization. We're in this period where everybody say, let's go to the local. As if the local, like Momodo and Christian, you were saying, the local is extricated from all of the global influences, and we just exist in our own orbit and we remain static, and African cultures, whatever that is, has remained untouched by modernity, and that's what it is, right? So I was cautioning us, like, if we're thinking about indigeneity, we have to be careful. Because the issue here is this: the indigenous or the local also becomes sometimes appropriated, and it becomes an alibi for maintaining colonial power relations. So the issue here is that why do you think Iran, for instance, is sanctioned? Why do you think Venezuela is sanctioned? Why do you think the xenophobic ideas that exist about China, they are scaring you, but everybody eats Chinese food, right? They say the Persian civilization has been one of the greatest civilizations, but Saudi Arabia does not have a problem with the United States. So the issue here is not even Islam, but they will tell you Iran has an Islamic regime and they are so terrible to their women and to their people, but Saudi Arabia does not get any of that rap. Why? Because culture is never an issue for the colonialist. Well, except for the French assimilationist politics in those years, right? Culture becomes a site. So in the neoliberal era, in fact, cultural difference becomes one of the sites for neoliberal expansion. This is why you go to the supermarket now, you have halal meat, because then that becomes a market where you could market to Muslims and stuff, right? Culture is never, so this is Fanon's point. Culture is never threatening unless it is tied in with the sovereignty question. The moment sovereignty so again, going back to my Iran example or the Chinese example, China has risen to the point that it is now capable of challenging Western domination. 500 years of Western hegemony in the world is now being challenged and likely to be undone by China. It's not about Chinese food. If China was just the culture, nobody will have a problem with that. But once you enter the area of sovereignty, we have the right to live by our own cultural logics. We have the right to look from our own position. We have the right to be able to express our sovereign control over our resources. Then all of a sudden you become a bad person. So we have to be careful. And this is what Fanon was saying about negritude. The people there's this beautiful passage. You mentioned national culture, but I actually want to go the end of Black Skin, White Mask. The conclusion. It is not because the Indo-Chinese has discovered some history or some culture that he is in revolt. It is because for many reasons, it is impossible for them to breed. That's why they are in revolt. So we are not interested. It's not, culture is important, but that's not the issue. The issue here is not, you could say negritude all you want. If it becomes an alibi for colonial domination, for imperialistic vocation, Fanon is not interested. Fanon is, if you are using culture, how does that culture allow you in the present to be able to transform your own condition, to be able to move away from those colonial systems? And actually culture, indigeneity, the local, all of those. I mean, there was a time in development politics when the World Bank was actually promoting the local. So the issue here with negritude was really that, and the contradiction that exists, that those who are promoting negritude were actually the most Frenchified people that you could ever find. That is one. But two, when we focus too much on culture without placing it within the current material conditions, then that becomes an alibi for the reproduction of some of the most oppressive colonial power relations within which. And this is why Fanon was like, I am not interested in culture for culture's sake. It is not because the Indo-Chinese has found some culture or historical fact about their history that makes them in revolt. We are dealing with the present that is oppressive. If my culture does not allow me to challenge that, I'm not interested in that culture. That is Fanon. But, and I'll end on this. Amilcar Cabral also was like, we should never forget the materiality of it, right? Do not think that the people are fighting because of the thing that is in your head. They're not interested in that. They are fighting because they want to see their lives go forward. They want to be able to change the condition within the week. So again, coming back to the first question, African solutions for African problems has to be situated within the current condition, adapting whatever it is to be able to transform the African condition as it has been reproduced within 500 years of colonial domination. So African solutions, it's not about something necessarily intrinsically or primordially African, but an idea that is grounded in African normativity and location, in which you bring multiple influences in order to be able to propose a solution to the problems that face the continent from the perspective of the continent.
I appreciate that so much. And you see it today, right? Because if you think about the terrain upon which struggle is waged, unless you have the question of culture rooted and connected to the question of sovereignty, it's very easy to wage the struggle on culture. Okay, we'll give you, you can wear kente cloth on this day. We will give you Martin Luther King Day. We will give you Malcolm X Day. We will give you all of these like cultural and icons of, and symbolism without changing the material conditions of people. And that's why if you constantly divorce culture from sovereignty, you're seeing it today, right? And then we have the Beyoncés of the world. And I think this is, I find it a dereliction of duty on the parts of academics, because you have courses at universities on Beyonce. That becomes a course in which you will have 300 Black people turn up to. But if you come have a course on Marxism and Pan-Africanism, you have 10 people turning up to that course. And that's happened at Cornell. But Ethan, go ahead.
Thank you. Am I unmuted? Can y'all hear me all right?
Yeah, we could hear you.
Cool. So, specifically on this point of culture, so Nkrumah in Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare discusses the idea of re-Africanization, specifically as a containment policy, which he describes as like a series of imperialist dogmas, right, that were imposed on Africa in the transition to independence, specifically because they were unthreatening to the core of European capitalist project. Sort of how we're recognizing now the material basis of culture, and culture as a weapon either for the oppressed or as a weapon to reproduce the system of oppression. And so I'm wondering if we can sort of like situate this historically, and when sort of these like mass social movements that have a distinctive and an explicit political economy, like perhaps even a Marxist orientation to them, at what point do we see like the absorption and transition towards a purely cultural movement that is divorced from like an ideological grounding in political economy, and even some absorption from NGOs and whatnot. So when do we begin to see this transition during independence and afterwards?
I'm happy you brought Nkrumah up, because Nkrumah is, Amadou knows this very well. Nkrumah is such an interesting figure. I mean, we're talking about the the independence generation, right? We talked about Senghor and Césaire and stuff, right? Nkrumah is interesting because Nkrumah started his political career. He was always a Pan-Africanist, but Nkrumah described himself as a scientific socialist, even though he's talking about Africanism. And for him, and then Nyerere and others, well, there are certain communitarian values in Africa, which is not an anathema to socialism, but it cannot be African socialism. It has to be scientific and all of this. So this is Nkrumah. That's one. But the second thing about Nkrumah is he actually started off by believing that political independence was the end goal. Seek ye first the political kingdom. Once you get the political kingdom, all others shall be added. This was Nkrumah's slogan for independence, right? Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all others shall be added. It's an interpolation of the biblical passage where Christ is saying, seek ye for the kingdom of God, right? Okay, so Ghana became independent in 1957, but Nkrumah had been and the head of government for a while. And then in 57, finally, Ghana gained independence, right? And the first thing, Ghana, Nkrumah understood the independence of Ghana not as a limited one country and political event, but it was the opening of the continent towards a continental government, the total liberation and unification of Africa. So the independence of Ghana, he said on the eve of independence, was incomplete without the total liberation and unification of Africa. So if you take Nkrumah's ideas, then the liberation of Africa is not complete because there is the unity part, the single government and stuff. But that's not the point that I want to make. Nkrumah started with the political slogan, Seek ye first the political kingdom. 3 years later, 2 years actually, from 1957 to 1959, 1960, Nkrumah already started talking about neocolonialism. Why? Because he understood that, oh, I was wrong. Political independence is not even, political power is not even the issue. You could have political power and people control your economy and your productive forces and all of that. That was the first thing. And here is the point. The book Neocolonialism was published in 1965. The next year, Nkrumah was overthrown. Why? This is the question that we are dealing with, right? So African solution to African problems, the issue of culture, the issue of how we imagine Africa and where all of this, it all boils down to some extent to sovereign control over African resources and sovereign control over African policy making and sovereign control over what are the solutions that we think will allow us to be able to move out of this colonialized world that adores all of this. Nkrumah was overthrown 1 year. In fact, there are cables when the CIA finally like declassified some of the. There was a whole debate taking place between the CIA and the MI5 or MI6. They are deciding, should we kill him or should we exile him? There are debates. The same thing with Lumumba. Lumumba basically killed himself. He signed his own death warrant in his Independence Day speech. We are no longer your monkeys. The history of Africa will be written, but it will not be written from the perspective of like all of those things, because the colonial system and the way in which the world functions is based on particular hierarchies. But in all of that, it's not culture. Culture is something you could give someone. You could allow people to live according to celebrating. You remove it from the real material stuff. And in this case, Marxism and Marx was right. The idea that it is the base, the economic base, that really determines everything else. Of course, Gramsci will come and say, well, yes, but you can't just focus on the base because the superstructure plays a significant role. And the way in which the superstructure is actually used is what ultimately leads to the production of hegemony. And so culture becomes important because you could celebrate, live according to your own cultural logic, as long as you don't touch the independence, right? So independence was also a moment of cultural reawakening. But part of the reason for that was that, again, like we said a while ago, colonialism was about denigrating African cultures and African personhood and African humanity. So independence, it was not just the material aspect of it, it was also how do we prove to the world. In fact, in Nkrumah's independence speech, he was like, we are going to prove to the world that the black man is capable of running his own affairs, right? That's what he was saying, because there is also a challenge. And this brings me to Tony Robinson's idea that racism really is a waste of time. Nkrumah did not have to say the black man could demonstrate. I mean, we have thousands of histories of empire building, of state making, right? To this day, people celebrate Mansa Musa, especially in the African diaspora. I don't like him, by the way, because I think he was very wasteful. But okay, right? So this day they celebrate him, Askia Muhammad and all of this. So Africa has a culture, a history, deep history of state making. But Nkrumah's response, or all of those independence people were saying, we have to demonstrate. And this is what Tony Robinson is like, racism is a waste of time. They tell you, oh, you're not a human being. Then you spend another 10 years trying to prove that you are a human being. Oh, you are incapable of governing yourself. Then you start to, like, the things that needs to be done are never done. But let's come back to this. So one, the cultural reawakening with the independence movement, it was not just a fluke. It was tied to history. It's just like when we were talking about negritude. It was tied to history. The problem, though, is that sometimes that cultural celebration became an end in itself. The material basis. So China, let's take contemporary China. The Chinese history and Chinese culture is implicated in the rise of China. Nobody is denying that. In fact, the Chinese, they call it, there is a century of humiliation that they always think back to. And then it's like, how then do we adapt our cultures? Not a static culture that exists only in the past, because this is how we tend to think of African culture when we invoke culture. But how does that allow us to be able to imagine ourselves as beings who have had governments, who have had civilization, who've had all of this, and how, and but by the end of the day, it's the material question, how you change the productive forces. And that is why, so people are not afraid of Chinese culture. The xenophobia that exists is not about Chinese culture. We all eat Chinese food. I doubt if there is a place, a village in North America where you have like hundreds of people that does not have a Chinese restaurant. But that's not what we are thinking of. Lunar New Year, people celebrate, you go to Chinatown, you buy. That's not what we are afraid of. We are afraid of TikTok. We are afraid of the economic might of China. So bringing that back to Africa, there was a time after independence, there was this pride in cultural restoration. For instance, in Zaire or the DR Congo now under Mobutu, the most damaging dictatorship and the most corrupt, one of the most corrupt governments that existed, and one of the most, the patsy for imperialism in Equatorial Africa, was also the moment for the vibrancy of Congolese rumba and culture. It's kind of crazy, right? So, but by the time we got to the 1980, culture became hollow because the economic basis and the material basis that is supposed to support that had been destroyed. So the financial crisis of the 70s and the 80s also led to a cultural decline in Guinea, in Sierra Leone, in Congo, in all of these places. And which then takes us to the point, and I'll end on this, which takes us to the point that culture is important. Nobody is saying that culture, to live within your cultural logic is significant. But in Africa, what has happened is that we have not been able to use our location and bring in influences that will allow us to expand, create a world in which we live without necessarily saying, but even the culture itself to expand it. This is why Gugi was saying, when you write in European languages, you are expanding those languages and you are diminishing and impoverishing your own language, because the way in which the language that you use on the everyday, it's also expanded and stuff, right? But we don't do that. So in actual fact, culture is impoverished, but also when you don't have the material basis to be able to support that, then it just become the shell. And people keep saying, let's go to the culture. And I'll end on this. I think what we need to do is, in our location, we use our culture, we adopt whatever it's out there in order to be able to think of the kind of world that we want. Unfortunately, colonialism imposes. And what I am suggesting is that if we start from that part that we are Africans, this is how we are located, and then we take multiple influences, we could create a different world based on our current condition and our current location. Unfortunately, the independence generation tried to do that, but then they got sidelined by something else. But also, they were also run against, let's not forget, the economic crises were triggered in the 70s. It's not just like African mismanagement. That was part of it, but it's also a global economic crisis that was generated precisely because certain countries, especially the United States, wanted to reinstantiate its hegemony and reestablish its hegemony in the world, especially when it was given a bloody nose in Vietnam and all of the money that it wasted there, right? Anyway, after a long rambling, I will end up by saying the issue of culture is very important, but that cannot be the sole thing that determines, because right now, Fanon will say there are crises, there are problems, and the appeal to culture is not enough. Unless that culture is able to imagine a new world that saves us from those problems, it will never be enough.
And absolutely. And I think you raised the point, right? I think given the denigration of the black subject, it is understandable why the response is what it is, right?
Yes.
Given how denigrated and how downtrodden and the oppression and the brutality and violence of white supremacy as towards black folk in this world, it's understandable why there is a retreat to, okay, no, we are not what you say we are.
Yeah.
right? I totally get that, I understand that. But I also want to, I guess I want to unpack this with you further, Professor. So you quite provocatively asked the question, what is African even?
Yeah.
Right? And I know some people are going to feel like, well, are you trying to say we don't have anything? Are you trying to say we don't have anything that is exclusively ours? And then I want to ask that and put that to you, but then add that with how people read the brilliant Sheikh Anta Diop. They will then say Sheikh Anta Diop's it could be a misreading, or it could be some people arrive at different conclusions or an appropriation. But they will say Sheikh Anta Diop evidences a singular source that explains the continuity and familiarity across the continent of Africa. How do you understand that?
Okay. Let's okay. I I have said when we were talking about negritude, right? I said we have to be respectful and be careful with the way we critique those who came before us. So I have my very idea about Senghor, and we were talking about Senghor and Césaire, and I was like, there was a reason why they were doing what they were doing. But at the same time, now we could see clearly sitting on their shoulders to say, you guys were wrong in this regard. And actually, you are very contaminated and complicated in the way in which you are thinking of this. Nobody could dispute that. You look at what they were trying to do. These are like basically Senghor and Césaire are actually a testament to the success of French assimilationist policies. Okay? I'm not critiquing them. I think I understand what they were trying to do and it was necessary to do what they were doing. But I cannot think of anybody better as a testament to the success of French assimilation than Senghor and maybe Césaire. Okay. So now that takes me to Sheikh Anta Diop. In the first place, I think one way of reading Sheikh Anta Diop is not the single source. And that single source, there is a reason why it's doing it, and I'll come to that, right? But it's also the colonial Eurocentric understanding of history that was actually driving him. Because Europe have this problematic idea that the Greek and the Romans, well, the Greek and then the Romans are actually the source of Western European civilization. So Sheikh Anta Diop was trying to construct that kind of history by saying Pharaonic Egypt is also, there is a cultural unity to Africa. Why do we have to follow Europe? Again, I understand what he was doing, because if they say you don't have a history, you don't, and these people have constructed their own history that way, then you could construct it and say, actually, we also have what you. This is why nationalist history in the post-independence era looked at centralization everywhere. The very standard of history that they were trying to say Africans have history, it was the Eurocentric basis of historical construction that they were using. This is why centralized kingdoms are everywhere in African history during this period. This is why we celebrate Ghana, Mali, Songhai. But was it the same logic as, for instance, France, where the king would say, l'état c'est moi? Was it the same way in which African kingdoms function? No. But we were still using the same Euro. And this is why, again, the invention of Africa is significant in that sense. Because to be able to reveal African history, to be able to reveal African philosophy, to be able to reveal African systems of thought, we still had to go to the European systems in order to be able to justify that and say, that which you say we do not have, we actually have. And you use the very standard that has been set by the Europeans in order to be able to demonstrate that. So that is the very first thing. So when Sheikh Anta Diop says there is a cultural unity to Africa, he's really drawing on the problematic European. That's what he's using as a standard. I try not to focus on that. I was in a conference in Dakar recently, and somebody was saying we have to have a governing policy, a governing philosophy, because that's what Sheikh Anta Diop says. The reason why Africa is suffering and we have not been able to do the things the way we do, because in the past, according to Anta Diop, that's what he was saying, that Africans had a governing philosophy. And for him, Ubuntu then should become that governing philosophy. And I'm laughing. I'm like, because Ubuntu, once you start talking about it that way, you have to construct it. You have to construct it to making a governing principle. And by the end of the day, you have to take it out of the context within which you operate. And I was like, but Ubuntu is not even necessarily about the state. It's about how you exist as human beings in relation to each other. Why do you want to legislate that? The moment you constitutionalize that, you change what Mudimbe calls the shows the text. The very primordial nature and the context of rationality of that thing is lifted out of its own context and brought. Again, that is useful. It could be useful, but don't pretend as if it's African culture that you are using without the idea that you are inventing that culture to put it to the very, again, whatever it is useful, and if it is useful, then use it. But don't pretend that it's the primordial idea that is informing your behavior and your practice when you are speaking to me in English or French or Portuguese. That is one. So Sheikh Anta Diop was basically being influenced also because what, again, is that negative to this period? You say we don't have history and we have to demo. And it's not only him. Kenneth Dike, the first Anglophone, Western trained Anglophone historian, in this was also how he started his political career. I'm sorry, his academic career. Actually going after Margaret Faham and trying to demonstrate that Africans had history. And here is the case. The West African magazine that decided to publish his work had to give it to Margaret Faham for her to approve that the sources that Kenneth Dike had used were correct. That was only the basis on which they would publish it, which means that the nascent African history itself had to be subjected to the standards of Western historiography. So that is one. But I think in relation to Sheikh Anta Diop, the most important thing for me, it's not really the cultural unity argument. I think for me, as a historian, I think he was grappling with the issue of how to narrate, how do you construct African history? It's a question fundamentally of historiography. How do you construct African history? Oral tradition could only take us like 100 years. Archaeology and kind of 14 dating could take us millions of years. In between, how do you construct, you come up like seriously? And so that was like methodologically and historiographically, that was what he was grappling with. And then all of those comments that then he was making that people take and all of that. And I'm not saying that he did not believe that Pharaonic Egypt is actually Black African. And it's detailed. But you also have to understand, why is it that when it comes to Africa, it's only in Africa that we have this debate. I was saying this I teach this course. It's a first year introductory course, and it's called Africa in the World, an introduction, right? So the very idea is that Africa has always been a world historical region. And we start with Pharaonic Egypt. And I'm like, I'm not even going to argue with whether they were black or white. Let's put that aside. But can you go to China and say ancient Chinese civilization is not Chinese? Why is it that when it comes to Africa, that's when we start saying, oh, well, they are not. Hegel is like, oh, no, they are not even, they are in Africa. Hegel had to reconfigure geography. Can you imagine that? Instead of admitting that Africa is a world historical region and as being a region of historical significance, he's like, I am going to reconfigure geography. So the very idea of sub-Saharan Africa is Hegelian. He cuts the North African tip, Carthage and Egypt, and says they are either Phoenician or European. Africa proper, which is sub-Saharan Africa. This is why when people say sub-Saharan Africa, it's a racist term. I don't use it. I only use it in inverted commas, right? It's a racist term because the idea is that the Sahara constituted a barrier, and then the North Africa is more developed because European influences came there, and the rest of Africa, the barrier prevented, the Sahara prevented Black Africa from whatever it is, right? But in West African history, you had the trans-Saharan trade, where people who actually crisscross the Sahara. Ouagadougou, Timbuktu, they developed as a result of Fez, Marrakesh. Like these are all termini of the trans-Saharan trade route. Agadez, Gao, Timbuktu, right? But there is this problem. So that is the first thing. And so when Sheikh Anta Diop then is writing, you have to understand that it's that history of saying Africans have no history that he is responding to. And he's then trying to say, okay, how do we construct a history of Africa? And again, the question that I was asking, why when it comes, it's only in relation to Africa that we start having this argument. Pharaonic Egypt is in Africa, but Hegel actually had to cut it out and say, actual Africa proper is where you have the Black people, right? So that is the first thing. And so Sheikh Anta Diop was responding to that. And when he says then that there were Black people, and the argument that he makes is actually like really persuasive. So but the second thing that I wanted to say also is that when the UNESCO General History of Africa project was commissioned, they actually were like, there was this Senegalese who was like I'm the head of UNESCO, and has decided, okay, let's rewrite a general history of Africa. Brilliant undertaking. And it's kind of crazy. We are in this moment, everybody's talking about decolonization or Africanizing knowledge, but they even don't know about the UNESCO general history as if they are trying to, right? When Sheikh Anta Diop wrote his chapter, European scholars were so triggered by it, they had to write a separate chapter saying that they did not subscribe to what he had written. Okay, so 2 points that I am making here then is that one, why is it that when it comes to Africa, always, like even civilization that is found in Africa, we try to come up with an explanation that says it's not African? Egypt is an example, Carthage is an example, the Great Wall of Zimbabwe is an example, right? Why? And then two, why were European scholars so triggered by Sheikh Anta Diop that they had to respond to his chapter in the general volume of General History of Africa, the UNESCO General History of Africa, with another chapter? So again, coming back to the question that you were asking, Sheikh Anta Diop is significant in that sense, but I think it's the historiographical question for me that is more significant. And finally, the other part of your question is that, are we saying that Africa does not exist? Of course, Africa exists. What I'm against is this idea that we know an African when we see it, right? And then it becomes colonial anthropology imposed certain categories on the interpretation of Africa that we have never been able to get out of. This is why I'm very critical of anthropology. And actually, to this day, when we think of ethnicity, when we think of tribe, the way we use those terms, the interpretation fetish, African religion is fetish. African people are not a people or a nation, they are a tribe. Like all of those, evolutionist, colonial, racist tropes that continue to define the continent, that were imposed on the interpretation of the continent, continue to inform. Even when we say we are Africans, sometimes it becomes very difficult for us to define ourselves outside of those tropes. And I'll end on this. This is why Pauline Hutunji in African philosophy, myth or reality, it basically is like African philosophy is any text that is philosophical, any text that is written by an African whose authors say that they are African and they are this is a philosophical text. There is a reason why he is defining it that way, because that's the only way you could define it outside of the essentialist notion of what Africa is and what Africa is not.
Thank you. No, I hear two things there, right? The first being, I think it's quite powerful to think, and quite, it's unsettling. I can imagine that, but I think it's about being truthful and reckoning. How African are you if to be able to define your Africanness, the categories are received from Western orders of knowledge? Like how
Colonial, Western colonial systems of knowledge. Yes.
And they even sometimes engage in like fetishization or centralization and tropes and mischaracterizations of Africanness. And I think that's quite unsettling. But I think reckoning with that really kind of, I don't know, I kind of I feel it's a fruitful actually discussion, a fruitful debate, because we can, we're not, I guess, beholden to a past that never existed, right? So let's move on into like a global Black perspective. And what I'm hearing from your answer then, to be truly African then, if we can even use that term or invoke that, to be truly African is to be someone of the world entirely. Someone to have a global Black perspective, a global African perspective. Given that the African is never abstracted or away from the world, then to be truly African then is to be of the world and in the world. So that kind of is a good segue to kind of, I guess, the position of Africa today as it pertains to like global political issues. So what does a Pan-Africanist world-making project offer as by way of analysis to some of the issues we're seeing in the world today? And maybe if Christian or Ethan want to hop onto that point as well.
Well, I guess the only thing I would add to that is like, how does the African perspective then spread to folks who may find themselves in the Caribbean or the States or be affected by, certain colonial events, the transatlantic slave trade, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we broaden the base of Africans who have this global perspective to those who are outside of the continent itself? And where is the legitimacy to that bond?
Ethan, do you want to add to that or?
I think I'll come up with a follow-up.
Okay, brilliant.
So, why was Malcolm X killed? You will hear, I know this is the Malcolm effect. So let's talk about Malcolm X 1 minute.
Mhm.
Why was he killed? You will hear that, oh, it's like the struggle within the Nation of Islam and all of that, right? That could be it. But Malcolm X became dangerous once he went to Africa. Once he went to Mecca and he took that trip to Accra, to different places, and he came back. His view had changed. Our struggle can no longer be basically an internal US struggle. We have to take it to the United Nations. We have to let sectarian divide not divide us. Because when the police bust your head, it's not because you are Christian or you are Muslim or you are this. It's because you are black. In Africa, they had Afro nationalism, and that was what gained them independence. In the United States, we have to also work for unity and advance the struggle against racism and freedom in this country, but take it to the United Nations. So we internalize the struggle and also link it to the African continent. There was no way he was going to come back from that. That's when he died. Martin Luther, when he was talking about, turn the other cheek, the moment he started talking about internalizing the struggle, linking the civil rights movement to economic disparities, to the war in Vietnam, that's when he became dangerous, right? So now let's come back. So when we talk of Pan-Africanism, the Pan-African idea had always been the struggle. Again, I started by referring to Nkrumah on the eve of independence. Apart from saying the black man will be able to rule themselves, again, that's his language. He also did say the independence of Ghana is incomplete. And once he started talking about neocolonialism, then that was the end of him. Lumumba, the Africans, would tell his own story. The point here is that if you take the global African perspective, every day, like, has it ever occurred to you that anywhere in the world that you find black people, they are at the bottom of the social hierarchy, even in the continent? You think it is because Africans are incapable of they have a mental state that does not allow them to be able to rise? There is a global power structure that has been constituted over 500 years based on racial exploitation, based on colonial exploitation, based on the denigration of certain humanity, and that anti-black mentality has been ingrained in the way in which the world functions through Jim Crow racial, plantation racial systems, but also through colonial impositions everywhere in the world. And so, if we are thinking really of a critical black or Pan-African perspective, and this is where it came from, then that we have to understand that the black person, all of us are a family. And then let's try to be able to support each other. So it's a solidarity politics. It's not, even though, like, again, others will say it was necessarily a racial politics, but Nkrumah never saw Pan-Africanism as a racial politics. The reason why he ended up marrying an Egyptian, that was a political marriage. He married an Egyptian because Egypt was very significant to the African struggle. This is why the ANC were trained in Algeria. This is not. So when you think of Pan-Africanism, that's what it was. Du Bois died in Ghana. George Padmore was with Nkrumah. George Padmore is a West Indian. Was with Nkrumah from the very beginning up to his death. So we have to understand exactly that Pan-Africanism had never been about race. Nyerere in Tanzania, whilst Idi Amin was expelling the Asians, again, and that we have to also understand, it's not a justification. What he did was wrong, but you also have to understand the colonial politics of racial hierarchies and hierarchization that had been imposed on East Africa from Kenya. To this day, if you go to Kenya, the Kenyans of Asian extraction tend to occupy certain economic areas. It's the same thing in West Africa. Like, for instance, the Lebanese were brought and imposed because there was this racial category. Scientific racism was really bad. The blacks are always at the bottom, and then you bring the Asians, then they become a buffer between the whites, right? And so in Sierra Leone also, that same how do you call it? The same ill feeling towards the Asians in Uganda exists there. The only thing is that it never became a state policy to expel them, right? So in Uganda, on the one hand, Idi Amin was expelling them. But in actual fact, in Tanzania, the Asians were part of the state and part of the independence struggle. Some of Isha Shivji to this day remains one of the most brilliant African academics that ever existed. He is there in Tanzania. He never left, right? But Nyerere's some of his closest friends or his closest comrades in the struggle for independence were Asian. But also the Asian there are actually kind of, I'm talking of the Tanzanians of Asian extraction, that's what I mean, were embedded, they live in the rural areas, embedded in society in such a way that you can't even get rid of them. So that two examples just give you an idea that when we're thinking of Pan-Africanism, even though it was understood from a particular racial perspective, again, this is the point that I was making. The scientific races and the categories of race that were imposed then became the galvanizing tool for Marcus Garvey and others. But the other generations that came after that, Nkrumah and others, they didn't understand Pan-Africanism necessarily as a racial construct. It was a wall-making tool that allowed Africa, and a geopolitical tool, by the way, that allowed Africa to be able to stake a place in the world that is commensurate with its size. And because history had dispersed the African people in so many different places, in the United States, in the Americas and in Europe and in different places, it was an idea for so-called the African family to form a solidarity relationship that allowed them to not only free the continent, but also fight for the well-being of Black people everywhere or African people everywhere. And here is the point. But it was also not only in relation to Africa. Adam Getachew's wall making after Empire is illuminating in that sense. It was not just Pan-Africanism, it was also the Third World Movement, the Bandung Project, the non-aligned movement. So Pan-Africanism has always been a mechanism, a political ideology for wall making. The fundamental underlying thing is that it is liberationary, it is solidaristic, but it is also the mechanism that will allow Africa to be able to harness all of its resources in order to be able to occupy a place in the world commensurate to its size. And I'm going to bring a very controversial example here because we have seen that example being put to the service of genocide recently. But the state of Israel taps into the Jewish diaspora, especially the Zionist diaspora. And that is part of its strength. The reason why it could get away with genocide, it's precisely because of that. It shames you if you're a Jewish person who does not believe in the project of the state of Israel and the Zionist project. It shames you, but it will go to everybody and say, you don't have to be Israeli, just support because this is a Jewish state. This is how it defines it. And this allows it to be able to tap into all of the resources that exist. Not everybody subscribes to this, but it has a pool of global Jewry that it is Jewry that it's able to tap into. That was how Pan-Africanism was imagined, not for the sake of killing people, because none of the Pan-Africanists ever talked about displacing people. It was about the way of tapping into the resources that exist, the African human capital, anywhere in the world, to be able to create a system, a fair system in the world in which Africa is able to occupy a place that is commensurate to its size. And I will end on this. Until and unless we fix the African continent, and I mean this, until and unless we fix the African continent and have this solidaristic politics that is able to uplift the African continent, the problem of the Black person everywhere in the world will continue to be a problem. The reason why African states in the 1960s, for instance, and I'll give this example, right? There was this guy, Phyllis John, who was the ambassador of the United States, of Sierra Leone to the United States. Normally, when you hear about the civil rights movement, you only talk about the internal politics, but African governments that had diplomats in Washington helped to break down the barriers of Jim Crow racism in the United States. It was not just the civil rights movement. It was also, if you say you are mistreating people here, but then you have African ambassadors that are coming and being dying in the White House, it shattered the imagery that they were trying. So Kennedy, when he was there, for instance, John was, I think, driving and he wanted to stop at a motel and they were like, no, we won't let you here. That created an international scandal. And the government had to intervene and then they started relaxing some of those rules and all of that. The point that I am making is that Africa has always, the strength of the continent has always been tied to its diaspora. So Pan-Africanism is not a crazy idea. It's not a racialist idea, at least the way I understand it. And I'm taking my cue from NASA and Nkrumah, for instance, or Nyerere. It was not a racialist idea. It was always a solidarity tool to be able to pool the resources of the continent and build a solidarity between the continent and its diaspora in order to be able to rejuvenate that place and situate it within the larger geopolitics so that the continent will be able to occupy the space that is commensurate to its size.
And I appreciate that deeply, right? So many thoughts in my mind right now, particularly this point of when we see the controversially Zionism, right? That helps explain Du Bois's comments on
Yes.
Zionism. I know people feel very uncomfortable with this. It's not the fact that he was absolving or would ever be in support of a colonialist project. It's that the way in which Zionism was able to mobilize even the term diaspora
Yes.
had such a potency and pull on people that it was able to be that project of what it is and give it its strength. And that's how we have to read when we read some of these scholars speaking about Zionism who are also anti-colonial. People seem to point out a contradiction in their thoughts and their works. But also we also see, and you reminded me, it was Chairman Mao who said our African brothers brought us to the Security Council,
Yes.
right? It was the official UN declaration of Zionism is racism was pushed by Sekou Toure and first debated at the Organization of African Unity and then brought to the UN, right? And this is what we mean by Pan-Africanism being a world-making project because yes, fundamentally it takes at its core the material conditions of black people, but that's never divorced from the diaspora first and foremost, the continent, but also the world in general itself. Because we who have suffered under the boot of colonialism the most are the first to recognize it, are the first to call it out. Ethan, please, I know you had a follow up.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to further unpack Pan Africanism, what it is and what it is not, especially not being, a racial project alone. And we talked briefly about what is Africa's primary task right now in terms
Mhm.
of the development of productive forces, in terms of not only political sovereignty, but economic sovereignty, right? So full scale sovereignty. And so I recently just spent some time, I was doing a study abroad, I was in Cameroon, and a lot of folks I had spoken to, especially folks who maybe worked for the government, were diplomats, had received some sort of educational and political training in the West, sort of had internalized a political realism, right?
Mhm.
And so I want to provide a counter to this realism, but specifically focusing on the task of developing the productive forces, why Pan Africanism is actually a strategic model, a necessary model, and why political realism is not a viable outlook, considering centuries under development and the task of overcoming imperialist siege currently, why Pan Africanism is actually a strategy of development.
Okay. I want to go, like, actually, you need to go to Addis Ababa and visit the AU headquarters. The vibe there is completely different from, like, there, Pan Africanism is still alive. Unfortunately, because African governments, we like to rely on others to pay our stuff, to pay for stuff, then sometimes the way in which they vision the development of Africa is completely different. But I want to start with what Momodu was saying, actually, in relation to the world making ideals. And you are right, Ethan, in actually pointing out very clearly what I am saying, that Pan Africanism cannot be reduced only to race. Race is part of it, but it's not only that. Again, and Nkrumah going to marry Fatia from Egypt, it was a political marriage that was actually, NASA was the middle person, tells you exactly, right? How they understood Pan Africanism, right? Because Nkrumah, like, basically was like, if we do not unite, this is there are, like, Nkrumah, there are so many. This guy was like, the Ghanaians are only beginning to understand him now. It's crazy. He, like, if we do not unite and we are fragmented this way, we are gonna be we are gonna face a danger that is heavier and dirtier and than the colonialism and the slavery that we've been subjected to. So at the founding of the OAU, a debate had taken place. Actually, there were camps, three different camps in Africa, right? You had the Casablanca group, led by Ghana and Morocco and Egypt, Guinea, Conakry, that basically said independence and unity now. And then you got the Morovia group, led by Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. They basically were like gradual unity. And that group actually was led by I think it was Nyerere was the one. So the debate, you had these groupings, and at the founding of the OAU, a debate had taken place between Nyerere and Nkrumah. And by the way, before Nyerere died, he was like he was wrong. He admitted that he was wrong. Just for the aside, right? What was the debate? Nkrumah was like, we got to unite now. All of the other things that you are pointing out in terms of language, in terms of these are practical, instrumental problems that could be solved. But if we do not take the condition, if we don't make the commitment to unite now, then we are never going to be able to unite. Nyerere had a different view where it's like, let's divide the continent into 4 regions and let every region work towards unity, and you unite and federate at the regional level, and at some point we will form the federated government of Africa. But look at African governments. Once you have power, you have ministers, the state power is, you are dying and all of that. It's going to be difficult to put away all of, I mean, Senegal and the Gambia, I normally, last time I got somebody into trouble, but I'm going to say this, right? Senegal and the Gambia. Gambia just exists in the mouth of Senegal. And they had formed, there was the first coup against Dauda Jawara by Kokoe Sambasanya in the 80s. And then they decided to form the Senegambia Confederation. But then that ended up falling apart, right? Because there were, and so Nkrumah was like, we don't have to pay attention to all of these issues of language and all of this. Because basically, I mean, there are certain big languages in Africa, right? You could maintain the colonial languages. Kiswahili or Swahilis in East Africa, develop that and transport it. You already have Arabic in the northern tip. In the western tip, maybe we could see like a Mande language that is neutral to everybody. And then, meanwhile, you actually develop not only the productive forces, but the cultural forces as well in terms of development of language in schooling and all of this, right? Because what he was afraid of was that the fragmentation of the continent based individual states is going to make it very difficult for them to compete even economically. Don't forget, Nkrumah started with political freedom, and later, very quickly, he realized that the economic aspect was part of it. That was actually key. But if you have these fragmented countries, how can a country like Sierra Leone or the Gambia, 3, 4 million people, 7 million people, going to compete against the United States? Like, really, realistically, how? But if you unite, then you have a major bargaining power where, right, and this is why, again, the commensurability of the size of Africa to its political weight in the world. That is one. But secondly, at independence, African governments had different relationships, like, for instance, with the State of Israel. At the founding of the OAU, whilst immediate unity failed, a continental policy in relation to how to deal with the Palestinian issue and colonialism around the world and how to deal with the State of Israel emerged. And very quickly, they passed a resolution. The PLO, until recently, I think it is still an observer member of the Organization of Africa, of the African Union, but back then the Organization of African Unity. I know I am originally from Sierra Leone. The parliament building in Sierra Leone was built by the Israelis because they were trying to, establish their relationships and stuff. In the middle of the construction, basically, the OAU made the decision, you guys had to get out, and every African country cut relationship with Israel. Unfortunately, that has changed. African countries are now going their individual ways. And you actually have like the Israeli spying on behalf of governments on the continent. I have had the Gambia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, some of those countries have now been doing backdoor dealings with the state of Israel. But in actual fact, Africa as a continent, as a political stance, has always stood by the Palestinian people. Africa as a bloc, through the Organization of African Unity and now the AU, have always stood with China. In fact, after the Chinese Civil War, Taiwan was in the, Modu brought this up, right? Taiwan occupied a seat for China in the United Nations Security Council. It was the African countries. Sierra Leone at least moved in motion, but the African countries, they basically voted to replace Taiwan with China. This is why Mao said, our African brethren took us to the Security Council. It is there, right? So the relationship between, let's say, Africa and China, for instance, right? Or Africa and the Palestinian struggle has always been one that is based on deep solidarity. But what it also tells you, if the continent, as fragmented as it is, could have such an impact in those times, imagine what it would be like if you have, like, really a unified government that acted as one with one voice. And Ethan, this ends with your question. The realist position, it's a position, a power privilege position. It's a power hierarchy position. Most of the time is that governments now, most of them have been trained abroad, and they incapable of developing an independent perspective if governments, because the IMF and the World Bank basically serve as the finance ministers for most African countries. And the problem here is that this started in the 1980s as a result of the economic crisis in the 70s. In the 80s, structural adjustment came and decimated African countries and basically imposed this logic of neoliberalism. And then economists were trained in the Western, whatever it is, and he who pays the piper calls the tune. And over time, over 40 years, you train people. There are very limited people who understand. But again, look at what is happening in the Sahel region. There is actually, whatever it is that you say about those guys, there is a real understanding that maybe they need to change certain aspect, either in terms of security, either in terms, right? But the continent is divided. But just imagine what we were able to achieve even within the framework of the OAU, the united position that was taken in relation to apartheid, the united position that was taken in relation to Zionism and the state of Israel and the Palestinian struggle, right? And the way in which the African countries, in solidarity with China, were able to, or the support that Cuba gave. Like, people forget that apartheid in South Africa ended because Cuba defeated the South African army in Angola. The Battle of Quito Canavali was a decisive battle in which basically the South African army that was talking about the white invisibility was shattered by the Cubans in Angola. And then they had to negotiate to pull their forces out of Angola because they were going after the ANC and come to Sizwe training camps and all of this, right? So the point here is that with solidarity lies strength. And the independence generation of African leaders, it was never lost on them. It was not only solidarity in relation to the African family, both within the continent and the diaspora, but it was also wall making on a global scale, solidarity with those with whom all of us have. And this is why China and India at the United Nations did more for the independence of African countries than the United. Normally, when I was in school, they were teaching us, oh, the Americans were against colonialism. That's a lie. The Americans wanted European colonialism to end because they had an idea of their own informal empire that they wanted to replace that with. But India, once it gained independence, Ghana gained independence. In fact, the overthrow of Nkrumah and the murder of Lumumba was such devastating moments in African history. Because all of those freedom fighters that were training in Ghana basically were sent back to their countries, right? So again, Pan-Africanism cannot be only seen from a power political sense, but even from a power political sense, it makes sense for the continent to be united, but only from the humanistic perspective and the solidarity politics. Imagine Africa, as big as it is, it's able to command the kind of economic power and political power that China commands and India commands in the world. And those three are in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Imagine what will happen. Or imagine Africa coming to the United Nations and telling the American government, stop killing black people. Just imagine if you have that force of power behind you, haven't developed your political standing, your economic, your productive forces, the weight of China. Let's say, this is how Nkrumah imagined Africa, by the way. What China is was what he imagined, where he's saying Africa will become a global power, but the way in which the Europeans did it, Africa will not do that. We will be a place, a continent, and a government that will care for international morality and solidarity. We will not use our power to oppress anyone. There is a speech of Nkrumah where he is actually laying out exactly what China is saying was how Nkrumah imagined a united Africa to be.
Thank you. Yes, Christian.
Yeah, no. Well, first off, I want to say when we talk about Africa and its potential to be a global power, I always think of, one day I just looked up the statistics, and if you look at the population of China, it's comparable to the population of Africa. So when you consider, the potential for Africa as a unified force could achieve, the things that we see China having achieved today. But I wanted to, on the point about solidarity, on the front cover of the Final Call, which is the Nation of Islam's newspaper, the front page says Cuba takes the lead, and in that paper they're referencing a, a recent conference that some of my comrades from the December 12th movement attended in Cuba regarding the International Decade of People of African Descent. And it kind of speaks again to, what you're raising about the power of leveraging, folks in the diaspora, and Pan-Africanism being a global movement of solidarity, and the power within that. So I guess what I want to ask you to kind of close out, because, there's theories and there's praxis, and there's what we need to do. What do you see folks needing to do, especially all of us, because all of us, are currently in America, right? We're all in the West. What becomes the work that we need to do, and how do we work to build solidarity to advance the material well-being of Africans worldwide? And yeah, what kind of forums do you see as the place for doing this? We've talked about, even Malcolm historically was talking about taking the issue of human rights to the UN, for example.
Mhm.
But now, in our current day and age, with a shifting political landscape and a shifting economic landscape, where do we find the centers of solidarity, and where do we find ourselves organizing and putting our effort to build a better future for African people globally?
And I guess
Wow.
I know a big question, just to kind of just kind of just add to that, I guess, and I think Ethan can do the same. Given what the shifts we're seeing on the continent at the moment as well, we're seeing the alliance of the Sahelian states. We're seeing this kind of a necessity to kind of go back to a unity project. What then do you think is it the fact that everyone just needs to become Marxists, for example? Is it that we will have to have a Marxist analysis? Where are the centers of organizing? And I think Ethan had something similar as well. We can add on to that as well to close out.
Yeah, my question is more so on the geopolitical front, but sort of something that I wanted to add to my last follow up was, does Pan Africanism, I mean, we know Nkrumah's version of Pan Africanism absolutely has a socialist orientation to it,
Mhm.
but as far as a development strategy, while also maintaining this world outlook that necessitates solidarity with all of those engaging in anti imperialist struggle, must it have a socialist orientation to it? And how are we understanding the Sahel, the developments in the Sahel in that regard? And also sort of like a rebuttal to those purists who might not support these movements that maybe fail to adhere to previous tenets of socialist projects.
We need to fix Africa. Again, I am serious about this. If we do not fix the continent, the fortune of every black person in the world, because Africa, even though we try to think of Pan Africanism not as a racial ideology, somehow people attach blackness to the African continent. That is one. But also, many black people in the diaspora were taken from the continent and brought abroad. Like, that is it. So, and the fortune of black people in the world, you would think twice if you had, it's like China, for instance. You don't mess with, like, whatever. Of course, I'm not saying that you do not have phobia and anti-Chinese racism that exists, but there is a pride that people of Chinese extraction, even if they are born here, will take in the development and the recent economic gains of China, and the fact that China is about to become a major, if not a global hegemon in terms of the different ways, the major power in the world, right? And I also feel that we need to rehabilitate Africa because, again, like I was saying, if Africa, as a united place that does not have all of these stereotypical baggages tied to it, takes its rightful place and comes to the United States and actually start talking about black people, like, imagine. And this year, again, Ghana was talking about the year of return and stuff of that. You know how many people, black people in the United States, decided to go to Ghana to just gain citizenship? Like, actually, sometimes when we think of migration, we need to also start understanding reverse migration, how people from like places like Brazil or in North America or the Caribbean are actually going to the continent. But imagine where there was such a vibrant economic space that existed so that you don't have to deal with police brutality. You could go to the continent and start a life and live. Imagine that that is possible. So, this is why I'm saying that we need to rehabilitate the continent. That is one. The second thing that I want to say, and I will come to how I think that maybe we could do that. Again, but the second thing that I want to talk about then is there are purists, and Momodu and I have had this conversation previously, right? Who believe that when you think of Pan Africanism, it has to be some primordial African culture that should determine. Again, I am not against using African culture as the starting point, but we have to recognize that that which we are calling African culture may not be necessary in an imperializing period of over 500 years. How do you know what in local culture is not maybe an interpolation of colonial intervention? How do you know that? So the question of what is pure and what is not, for me, does not make sense. Get it out the way. Use whatever is available in order to be able, from your location and the way you view the world and how you understand your own standing, to be able to construct a politics that allows you to escape the restrictions that the colonial has imposed on you. And if that means also tapping into some of the things, even the colonial brought, like for instance, Nigeria, if you say you are going to impose Hausa Fulani or Hausa as the language, the lingua franca in Nigeria, you're going to have a civil war. So in some places, and this is why the debate between Achebe and Gugi, I see both of their points. Gugi is like, when we speak other person's language, we write in other person's language, we are impoverishing ours and we are enriching theirs. Yes. But Achebe was like, but in Nigeria, this language has been given to us. We have been enslaved for it. It's now ours. We could also use it in the way in which it serves us and it makes sense to us. It doesn't mean that that is the only language that we use. It doesn't mean that you use that language to denigrate the other languages that you have, but it becomes part of the African pantheon. It's given to you, imposed on you by colonization. You take or you make of it what is it that you like. There's this Nigerian author, Amos Tutuola. The book, the novel is The Palm Wine Drinkard. Oh my God. Like if you read, it is English, but it's not. Just the way he plays with the words, right? And that's what Achebe is saying. This is ours. We could do whatever it is we want with it. But also, Valentin Mudimbe ended his his intellectual academic career by writing a chapter. It's called In the House of Libya, in which he is looking at the bibliothèque, the Greek bibliothèque, and reconstructing the history of the three continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And ultimately, by reading the bibliothèque, he reconstructs a history in which Europe and Asia are actually at the margins of Africa. It is significant because sometimes that which we claim is European had been ways in which they have appropriated from local cultures that they encountered and incorporated it within their own pantheon that it becomes theirs. Why can't we do the same? This is the point, right? We could also take that which comes from elsewhere, but by the end of the day, we incorporate it within our own pantheon and put it at our service. So, and this takes me to the question of Marxism. Are you really trying? I'm not saying you guys now, but people who are purists, would you say Samin Amin is not African? Are you really saying that Walter Rodney is not African? Because I know he's from the Caribbean, but he understood his world as African from the diaspora. Are you saying Walter Rodney is not African and his analysis does not allow us to be able to understand or construct a particular kind of politics? Is Fanon African or not? Is Amilcar Cabral African? I will leave that question for those who like to go to purity. We have people who are as African as it could get, but they also understood that the problem of the continent, the way in which the continent has been denigrated for over 500 years, that appeal to culture is not going to be enough. That appeal to primordiality is not going to be enough. It is going to take a politics of reinvention that uses all of the elements, but starting from where you are located and use that in order to be able to construct a politics of solidarity, a politics of governing philosophy, if you want, a politics of how to think of the economy in order to. And this is why Sami Amin and all of those Afro-Marxists, and this is the point. The reason why Amin and others raised the question of development the way they did was because exactly Western Marxism was incapable of understanding their very own condition within which they emerged. Frantz Fanon, in a very skillful way in The Wretched of the Earth, he says this is why Marxist analysis have to be stretched each time we deal with the colonial question. Every time. So Marxist analysis, these guys are not derivatives. They are adaptative abstractions based on their own very conditions. But let's stop there. Let's go to Arrighi and Wallenstein and others. And let's go to Robinson, racial capitalism. Everybody talks about racial capitalism. World systems analysis would be impossible were it not for its African groundedness. Arrighi and Wallenstein, they were all at Dar es Salaam and they were like traveling the African continent. And I'm not just making this argument to say Africa is a place generative of ideas. That's not what I am saying at all. So, like you use Africa as a cannon fodder to come up with theory. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Africa is a place that is generative of ideas, that it is able to inscribe. And these people were there. They were talking to Africans on the ground. They were looking at the analyses that were coming out of there. Robinson's racial capitalism basically appropriated South African analysis and then it ended up generalizing it to a larger audience. And then that became everybody's talking about it in that way. So these guys were basically, we are in Africa. Even Johannes Fabian, time and the other. It was when he went to Africa, then he realized that anthropological categories as they were making it impossible for him to be able to understand Africa. That's what led to the writing of Time and the Other. So the African continent itself, the point that I'm saying, is a space of ideas. Sibagro Vogi and Robbie Shilliam, two of my very close elders in this business, Robbie Shilliam wrote this paper, Race and Revolution in Boaki Yaman, where he's reading the Haitian Revolution not as an offshoot of the French Revolution, but actually as an African revolution. The way in which people in Haiti use African spirituality and African ideas in order to be able to understand their condition and engage in a liberationary project that ultimately overturned slavery. And the Haitian Revolution did more for the abolition of slavery than Wilberforce ever did, but it is Wilberforce that we hear about, right? Or Siba basically also in relation to Palmeiras in Brazil, how they were able to form a self-governing community. And his point is that the ideas that they had with them, they brought from Africa. He's not saying that these are African ideas in the sense that the primordial region of emergence in Africa, but those ideas had been formed on the continent based on multiple influences. There is an Arabic influence, there is a local Mande influence, there is all of these influences that put together that allowed them to be able to understand what freedom is outside of what Rousseau and anybody else was saying. So there is a place to start. It's already there. When we talk of you were mentioning Cuba being central, but in actual fact, years ago, a Cuban family returned to Sierra Leone. You know how? They returned because there is a song that they were singing that have been handed down from generation to generation. They were able to trace their origin to Sierra Leone. And they went to the village and they were singing the same song with the people that existed in that place. So slavery also was not this damaging thing that or colonialism did not reproduce blank subjects. There are what you call African retentions, ideas, cultures that remain. How you harness that will take skill, but it will have to be subjected to the condition of the now. So finally, what do we do? Again, solidarity is important. And there are politics that are taking place. The only thing is that in Africa, you have multiple forces that are playing. For instance, what is happening in the Sahel contrasts to what is happening in Kenya or what is happening in Ivory Coast, right? And so this is why the issue of continental unity is important, because you have all of these buffoons that are emerging in different countries who have no understanding of where their position, their societies stand, but they have a particular understanding of the world. It's like, if I just go closer to the Americans don't like you. Basically, Malcolm X had this idea, right? The wolf and the wolf and the fox. He's comparing the Democrats and the Republicans. But you could actually extrapolate on that and say global imperialism is actually that. The Americans will come and talk to you and say, right? So finally, then how do we approach this? I think fundamentally there has to be a transformation of world order to allow for local forces. So globally designed but locally implemented. And the rise of China is significant in this. And I'm gonna end on this, right? People will say, oh, China is an imperialistic power. I'm like, well, you don't understand what is happening. The rise of China, the reason why in the post-independence era, African governments were able to experiment with different forms of state-making policy was because of a multipolar world order that existed. It was dangerous, don't get me wrong, because the Americans overthrew, the Belgians and the Americans overthrew Lumumba and replaced it with, right? But at the same time, it was not one jacket where structural adjustment was just imposed and neoliberalism became the way in which you made. Even corrupt governments were still experimenting with different forms of state making. Even Mobutu, as corrupt as he was, like basically went to Zarianization, Africanization, and changing people's names and all of that, right? They were all able to experiment with different kinds of wall making because the global environment allowed for it. Development was understood as a public sector led project, and different states were able to experiment with different policies while coordinating also at the global solidarity level in terms from the Bandung project, the non-aligned movement, the tricontinental, and all of that. So the issue here then is that the rise of China is creating a possibility for the return of multipolarity that will allow serious governments to be able to experiment with different forms of state making, right? And I will end on this. I know I have rambled a bit. I will end on this. In 2000 and I think 14, John Kerry was the Secretary of State for the United States, went to Addis Ababa. The Chinese premier also went to Addis Ababa to address the African Union. John Kerry was basically lecturing Africans, you need to have democracy, you need to respect human rights, and all of this. The Chinese premier was like, our development is contingent on yours. No, just think of this, right? And it's like, we know that you are used to people coming to take things from you, but we have that history too. This is why we think that, given the historical ties that we have with you, we have things that we could give you, and you have things that you could give us. We could form a solidarity that allow us to be able to have mutual beneficial relation that does not require domination or exploitation. This was what the Chinese premier was saying. I usually ask my students this question. If you are the president of a government in Africa, which of those two speeches would you take seriously? Which one would you be open to? Somebody coming to lecture to you, and the other person saying, we understand you. You are like us. We share a similar history, right? And I think the rise of China has been mischaracterized. Again, I started by saying part of the reason why China is feared, it's not because of its culture. China is feared because of its economic might. And all of the scaremongering that you have about China being exploitative and all of this, it's emergent from that. Am I saying that China's Africa relationship does not have problems in different places? Every relationship, even I fight with my wife all the time. So what are you talking about? Like every relationship is fraught with different kinds of difficulties. But the rise of China creates a potential that will allow African governments and those of us who are working for different kinds of outcomes to be able to think. I mean, the reason why the Sahelian state project is possible, it's precisely because of Russia and China to some extent. Because there is a different architecture that you could apply to. In Sierra Leone, in 2015, I think the government wanted to do telecommunication reform and expand it. And the IMF and the World Bank just basically was like, well, we are giving you this money, but you need to embark on austerity. Imagine, in an election year. It's like, even though we are corrupt, but we are not fools. So they went to the Chinese, and the Chinese provided a different form of loan architecture to expand the same project. That is what I mean. In a solidarity economy, in a solidarity politics that is multipolar, whilst dangers exist to get rid of governments you don't like, there is also the opportunity for you to experiment with different form of state making. And I think those of us who are interested in the Pan-African idea, the rejuvenation of Africa, we have to see our standing in the West or in the diaspora with what is going on in the continent as a continuum. The way Malcolm X saw it, the way Martin Luther, the way Du Bois, the way George Padmore, or even Garvey saw it. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Until next time, people.